By the time Ataturk died in 1938, the citizens of Turkey had witnessed enormous changes to their daily lives. Islam had been removed as the source of social cohesion. They had seen their alphabet change from Arabic to Latin characters. Even the clothes people wore changed. But the important question still remains: did Ataturk bring about a revolution?
This video is a part of Project Revolution, a collaboration between different YouTube history channels attempting to explore revolutions throughout history.
In order to answer whether Mustafa Kemal, aka Ataturk, the name given to him meaning father of the Turks, brought about a revolution during his presidency from 1923 to 1938, we have to go back to the late Ottoman period. By the beginning of the 19th century, Ottoman statesmen had become aware that something had to change. For more than a century, they had become second fiddle to European powers such as Russia. We have to remember that from the 15th to the 17th centuries, the Ottomans were a dominant imperial power. And this awareness for change ushered in something known as the Tanzimat Period, an era which lasted from 1839 to 1876 that was distinguished by numerous liberal reforms intended to stop the collapse of the empire and help it compete with other European powers. This is important for us to understand because many of the reforms that Ataturk would later institutionalize were actually introduced during the Tanzimat period or even before. For instance, as part of Ataturk's clothing reforms, in 1925 he passed a law concerning the wearing of the hat. This banned the fez and replaced it with Western-style hats because he wanted them to become a symbol of progress. Seems revolutionary enough, right? Kind of, because the Ottomans had already done something similar 100 years before. In fact, in 1829, the Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II issued a royal decree which replaced the turban with the fez because he wanted to give a homogeneous look to his subjects and break from the past. So Ataturk's rationale for removing the fez was the exact same as for its introduction in the first place. Let's take a look at another prominent example. In 1928, Ataturk did something extraordinary when he adopted the Latin alphabet and removed the Arabic script. On top of this, he decreed that the transition phase would only be 3 months. That has to be revolutionary, right? Maybe, because whilst this was extreme, the Ottomans were not ignorant to language reform either. Indeed, the Tanzimat reformers imposed a moratorium, a ban, on the coining of new terms from Arabic or Persian sources. This was done to simplify Ottoman Turkish. What about politics? Late Ottoman reformers had already begun to model their commercial and penal law codes along European lines. But the civil law code was still left in the framework of the Sharia law. Having said that, Ottoman reformers were aware of the need to limit the power of the ulama, the religious class, because they viewed them as the custodians of tradition and therefore lacked the open-mindedness needed to carry out modernization and reform. Ataturk, on the other hand, had far greater political ambitions. His ideology can be reduced to 6 key notions, or arrows, 2 of which were nationalism and secularism. These two would combine to create a state that citizens of the region had never experienced before. Before we explain their consequences, we should understand what nationalism and secularism are. Nationalism refers to an ideology that puts the interests of a person's nation above any other. What's a nation, you say? It's the collective community that is based around a common history, language, or culture. So what's so bad about that? Well, nationalism maintains that the nation is not only the highest, but the only form of political legitimacy. This is part of the reason why nationalism attracts militancy. Like this guy. For a Muslim society like Turkey, this was going to be a big problem because Turkey's predecessor, the Ottoman Empire, had been organized along religious lines in the millet system, and the empire's very existence was justified as an Islamic caliphate. Then we have secularism, which is not, as some Muslims like to think, a synonym for atheism. No, secularism simply means a separation between religion and state. From a Western viewpoint, you're probably thinking, what's the problem with that? Well, like I mentioned, the Ottoman Empire had been ruling for hundreds of years based on religious justification. This was now gone. So, did Ataturk bring about a revolution? Many of the changes he made had already been experimented with in some form or another by the Ottomans. Let's not forget that Ataturk himself was a product of the late Ottoman period at the turn of the 20th century. But the fundamental point still stands. The pace at which changes were brought to Turkish society from 1923 to 1938 means that what Ataturk was able to achieve was certainly a revolution. This is best punctuated by the fact that the transition between Arabic to Latin alphabet was only afforded 3 months. We're talking about a cultural and a literary tradition that had been in place for millennium, was done away with in 3 months. I think that a vital difference between Ataturk and the late Ottoman reformers seems to have been this. Tanzimat reformers knew that Western powers were technologically and materially superior to them, and therefore they had to adopt certain Western ideals which suited them. But the Ottoman reformers still maintained a sense of confidence in their own cultural superiority to the West. Ataturk, however, straight up said international, aka Western social and cultural standards were better than the ones that had been in place during the Ottoman Caliphate. This can also explain why he brought changes so quickly, because he felt there had to be a sense of genuine urgency for Turkish society to reform in order to survive in the new international order that was being carved up by the Western powers after World War I. And now for my favorite part, Hikmah Musings, the part where I try to take a lesson away from the subject of the video. So we've decided that Ataturk did bring about a revolution, but what can we learn from it? Firstly, we have to talk about the Kemalist policy of secularism. This idea had been impressed upon various reformers and nationalists throughout the Islamic world in this period, because it was believed to be a key indicator for progress, as Europe had already demonstrated. So Ataturk's thinking was, to be as successful as Europe financially and militarily, we have to think like them as well. I like that sentiment, but the formation of an entire society's perception cannot be based on a simple copy and paste scenario. For all intents and purposes, secularism seems to work in Europe, but I highly doubt that it can work in Muslim societies. The reason for this is simple. Islam is more ambitious than Christianity. Christianity intends to be a religion that aims to give spiritual direction on the path to salvation. Islam, on the other hand, projects itself as a complete package. Through Sharia law, it aims to guide every facet of not only individual life, but also that of a society's. In this context, to divorce a religion which has its roots in every aspect of a community from politics will necessitate a violent and almost unnatural separation. This helps to explain why the current president of Turkey, grossly unpopular in the West, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is eroding many of Ataturk's secularist policies, and so many Turks are loving him for bringing Turkish society closer to Islam. Secondly, I would say don't be so quick to judge Ataturk negatively for his policies. Today he is condemned by millions of Muslims who feel he betrayed Islam for not only ending the Caliphate, but more importantly his policies. I think in order to make a judgment about this great man, you have to, as much as you can, put yourself in his shoes. At the time, almost the entire Islamic world had been colonized by European powers. whose dominance on the global stage can hardly be compared to any other point in history. It's tough to blame Ataturk for wanting to be like the people who were writing the standards for everything, from technology to the military to education. And it's important to mention that his main aim in adopting European customs was not necessarily to be a cheap imitation of them, but because he felt it would give his nation the best chance of surviving in a world that was overwhelmingly dominated by Europe.
I want you guys to check out Guy Blokes' video on the post-World War I Free State of Bottleneck in Germany, and Mr. Beat's video on the Singing Revolution in the Baltic countries.
I want to thank all of our patrons for supporting this video. If you want to help Hikmah History, please consider checking out our Patreon page. The link is in the bio. Until next time, peace.